I'm so excited to have you all here at our May webinar, Standout College Essay Secrets. Um, a couple of housekeeping items before we jump right in. Um, the first is that this meeting is being recorded and you will get a recap of it along with the recording afterwards. So don't feel the need to take crazy notes. We'll send you a summary along with the recording later this week. And then the second piece is that we will have time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So as we're going through things, if you have a burning question, toss it in the chat, write it down. We will address it if it makes sense at the moment, but we will definitely circle back to it at the end. Um, so I'm Mackenzie. I am Signet's marketing manager. I've been with Signet for a couple of years now, and I'm joined by some admissions experts today, and I'm so excited that you all will get to hear from them. I'm going to take a moment to introduce everyone and stop my share while I do so. Um, so first we have Sheila, who is Signet's president and CEO. Sheila, thank you for waving. She's also an admissions consultant and has helped countless families and students navigate this journey. So I'm excited to hear your expertise today. We also have Holly. She may be familiar to some of you all. She was on our panel last month. She's a jack of all trades. She is an admissions consultant with Signet. She is a writing specialist with Signet. She also does test prep and um, coaching and brings all of that expertise into her work with her students. Um, we have Joanna. Joanna, can you give a wave? She is an admissions consultant with so much experience in the admissions industry. She's really an expert at helping kids really achieve their and unlock their full potential navigating this journey. Um, and then we have Andy, who was with us like Holly was last month on our test prep panel. Similarly, a jack of all trades, but he is putting on his writing specialist hat for the purpose of today's session. Um, he works really well with helping students paint the most beautiful essays that they can include in their application essays. And then we have Alex. Alex, can you wave? She is a writing specialist with Signet. She's been in education for years and really does wonders in helping students portray their authentic voice in their Common App essays. Um, so I'm so excited that you all are going to learn from them today. For the purpose of today's webinar, Standout College Essay Secrets, we're going to dive a lot into the personal statement. There are other pieces of writing included on the college application, such as the supplemental essays, the additional information section, the challenges and circumstances section, and then there are essays for non-Common App schools. We will have webinars later in the summer where we'll cover those pieces of writing. But for the purpose of today, we're going to dive really deeply into the personal statement. I do want to ground us a little bit into why we're talking about this now. And the reason is summer's right around the corner, and we know that summer becomes a really busy time for students, and they also check out of school. And so before they do that, it's really important for them to get a plan in place for their writing. So all of the juniors that are working with Signet right now are doing this with their consultants and their writing specialists. They are brainstorming, mapping out topics, making a schedule, and just getting ahead of it before it's too late. The last thing that we want is for your student to enter senior year and have a rigorous course load and all of their typical extracurriculars and their college application and college writing on top of all of that. So it's really smart to start working on this now to save you stress later on. I also want to say that college essay writing, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, is quite different than academic writing. So it's different than what your student might be used to. They might be really good at writing and can whip out a history paper overnight, but the type of writing that is involved in essay writing is a lot more reflective, it's a lot more vulnerable, and it can take more time. So all that's to say is now's the best time to start talking about it. So we're going to have hopefully a really great discussion about all of this. So to kick things off, Joanna, I would like to ask you, how would you describe the purpose of the personal statement?
Thank you, Mackenzie, and welcome everyone. The before I think to understand the role of the personal statement, I kind of like to zoom out and think about the application very holistically. And the way I describe it to students and families is that your application is really like a jigsaw puzzle. And so every piece of your application, so your transcript, those test scores, if you choose to send them, your letters of recommendation, everything needs to fit together nicely and neatly to tell sort of the broader story of who you are as an individual. But the personal statement, you should think of that as sort of the main image of that jigsaw puzzle. So that really is sort of your flagship statement. It should share something about you that is not going to be obvious in other parts of your application. So if you're reading the personal statement and it feels like a recap of your activity list, you may have missed the mark a little bit. Or if it's a recap of projects that you did in some of your academic classes, you may have missed the mark a little bit. I know we'll get into a lot more detail, and so I don't want to feel like it's being overly prescriptive, saying these are the rules that you should and you should not tackle because there's a lot of nuance here. But the way I always look at the personal statement is it should reveal something insightful about the students that wouldn't necessarily be obvious. So it should make them become a bit more three-dimensional.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing. Holly, I'm curious if you have anything to add.
Yeah, yes, to everything Joanna just said. Um, I think that the personal statement's goal is often to unify, to take all of these disparate perspectives and activities and all of those things and bring them to center so that we understand how one human being chose to do all these things and how all those things had special meaning to them and their life and passions and goals. So especially if someone does a lot of random stuff, it's the unifier.
Mm,
If a student may be like very, very focused, very intense, and the application may feel like it's leaning on one side of a student that may be super impressive, but is missing the heart, or feels like it might be over teaming and things like that, then often the personal statement can be a balancer, a counterbalance that it can show a sense of vulnerability or humility in the face of an overachieving application, or it's a way to create another way to create a three-dimensional picture of a person.
mhm. That's really beautiful. Um, Sheila, Andy, or Alex, anything else that you'd like to add?
I mean, I think they covered it. I
Mhm.
especially want to like plus up what Holly said. It's a place to um, maybe balance or emphasize certain things that you really want to make sure get shown. I love it when there's a surprise in there for the reader. But we'll get into all of that as we get through the rest of our questions.
Yeah. Now, the personal statement, the Common App does require students to respond to a prompt. I'm going to post the prompts in the chat so that you can all see them. Um, but Sheila, I'm curious how you approach navigating the prompts with your students.
I mean, it's a really good question because I don't want them looking at the prompts, not right away, at least. I find that, the college essay is very different from anything a student has had to write in school. And when they see a prompt, it feels like an assignment. And I want to break them out of that a little bit, right? So we're actually brainstorming essay topics before I even tell them we're brainstorming essay topics. I'm always asking them about, some random thing that they mentioned, or, I was in a session with a student just earlier this week and he was meeting with me from his bedroom and there were a lot of photographs on the walls. So I was just like, talk me through all of those photographs. Are you a photographer? Who gave you your first camera? What do you like taking pictures of? And we got to a really amazing story about why he loves taking pictures of sunrises and sunset. As an astrophysicist or a budding astrophysicist, he's mad that we can't look directly at the sun, but
Mhm.
at sunrise and sunset you can. So I'm like, okay, we're basically done. I know your essay. Um, but we will take our time then and take a story that feels really meaningful or very representative of something we want to demonstrate about a student, and then try to match it to one of the prompts. And as you'll see, from the chat, these prompts are pretty broad. You can make anything work for almost any one of them. Um, so that's typically how I like to approach it. But I will also say some students need something to respond to. right? Sometimes that sort of meandering conversation just stresses them out and they're just like, what do you want to know from me? And so then we will go through some of the prompts and a little bit like a free association, just rapid fire, what comes to mind, what story would you tell? Um, and then we'll move from there. But that's generally how we start.
Interesting. Thank you. Um, Andy, how do you approach talking about the prompts with your students?
Yeah, well, Sheila didn't leave much meat on the bone there because we approach it very similarly. In fact, and I've stolen some of her tricks to get students talking. Um, but yeah, I'm a fan of trying to develop it organically, if at all possible, and sort of sneakily figure out what their essay is probably going to be about before they kind of figure it out, so I can, guide the conversation in certain ways. Um, I would I would add a couple other things about the prompts. Um, the last prompt is basically do whatever you want, right? Which I always tell students basically means they don't care about the prompts, right? And so the prompts are very much there to help if they help. And so we don't want students feeling like they have to squeeze their story into one of the prompts. Um, as far as I know, admissions officers don't even like care which one you choose. I don't even know if they look at which one you choose. They're just looking for a compelling piece of writing that gives them insight into the student that the rest of the application can't. So yeah, I generally don't go prompt first, although there have been students where, as Sheila was saying, like that's the way to go. And maybe some of these ideas will allow, will spark a memory, just the way that the prompt frames it will allow them to maybe retrieve something of value.
Mhm. Thank you. Um, I'm curious if Joanna, Holly, or Alex, either of you approach this in the opposite way and go prompt first. No.
I think most of my conversations with students start like kind of like Andy said, very organic. I lead with curiosity. And I just want to know, like, who are you? Tell me a little bit about yourself. We end up at some point we talk about like, what are you watching? What are you reading? Like, tell me some stories about yourself. And I think what's also helpful maybe at that early stage too is just to remind students that this isn't like the one and only story. This is an essential story that gives us clear insight into something uniquely you, but it doesn't need to be like we are honing in on the one story.
Thank you. Um, well, that kind of leads me to my next question, which is how should students start brainstorming the topics? Alex, do you have any specific, besides what you just shared, any other kind of activities that you use with your students to start their brainstorming process?
Yeah, I mean, I've probably stolen some from Sheila as well here, but asking students like, how would other people that you love talk about you? Or what are some things, if you were thinking of like memories, snapshots from your life that are just essentially very you, like what would come up? And it's okay if those things seem really small. I think a lot of students are surprised that it's those small things that they would not normally pick that don't maybe fit with everything else that they think they're portraying in their application. Like those little stories end up becoming like, oh yeah, this is absolutely who I am, and how could I not share this?
Hmm. Yeah. Andy, do you have any other conversation starters or activities that you use with your students to brainstorm?
I'll often go to, how would your friends and other people describe you? Um, I'll, I'll often say, hey, what are you into? And just, like we're buddies. And yeah, I had a session last week where like Sheila, I noticed some things in the background. And I was like, hey, what's that? What's that? And, and then one of them was totally insignificant, but the other one led to a really great story about summers he spent in Greece with his grandfather. And, it's early yet with this student, but that's clearly going to be something if it's not the personal essay. It's going to be sort of, a background supplement or something like that. Um, and then, I'll pass it off to Sheila for her little thing that we've all stolen.
I mean, we don't need to use the language of private property here. These are just ideas. But I know the exercise everybody really loves is something that I call show and tell. And everyone in the audience, you're free to use it. We're not stealing, don't worry. But basically, it's just that, bring me three things that you really care about, are meaningful to you, represent something about you, and just bring them to the meeting. I don't need you to do anything else. And then I'm just going to ask you a million questions and we're going to get somewhere. Like something always comes out of that. I've had students bring me a note that they got from their ballet teacher when they were in sixth grade. I had somebody else bring in a pin that somebody gave them. Somebody else, oh my gosh, this was so long ago. This kid was a real animal lover and he had handmade his dog's collar. So he brought me the dog's collar, and I was like, I think your dog needs that. And then a recent one, actually, this is a student Holly and I worked together on. He was like, okay, I have to take my computer outside. And it was like very laborious getting outside. But he wanted to show me a pole vaulting pole that would not fit in his room. And that, wasn't the subject of his main essay, but it did make it into his application. So it's always really fun.
Joanna, do you have any other activities that you use to start kind of getting the wheels moving on with students when it comes to the personal statement?
So similar to what Sheila shared. I always tell students, this is not an original topic. I actually stole it from Duke University 20 years ago because it was an old essay topic of theirs for undergrad. And actually, it's been reinvented now. If you ever apply to Duke's business school for your MBA, it's actually one of their essay topics now for their business school. But it's called Top 25. And I just tell students you have to set a timer for 30 minutes and sit down and start writing up to 25 things about yourself. And there are no rules to the exercise other than you can't give me a list of 25 adjectives. If you do, I'm going to kick it back to you until you like give me an example of each of these things. And very similar, I think, to show and tell, it forces students to really think about, what does it mean to them? Like what's personally significant to them? And it could be, for some students, it's a movie, it's a movie that changed their life. For other students, it's, I had a student who said like one of their most proudest accomplishments is that Chipotle follows them on the official Chipotle account follows them on Instagram. Because they had 47,372 points in their account. I had a student recently, just a few weeks ago, include a note about how she used to cry when her family played Monopoly and then it was banned in their house. And it released this, and as we got talking about it, it sort of released this whole other storyline around competition and competitive fire and how Monopoly has become contraband in their house. And she and her brother like pooled their allowances to go buy a new version of it. It was, so I think it's more about, it's sometimes less about what is actually in the list and looking for those themes and starting the conversation to get students to also articulate why they chose to include some of those things. Because I think oftentimes they don't realize why things are significant in the moment. They just know this says something about me, even though I'm not entirely sure what. And so I always enjoy the process of kind of pulling on those little threads. The other thing I just want to plus one to the activity around asking people to describe you. So I do something similar, but I ask students to go and talk to 5 to 7 people in what I call different concentric circles of their life. And so the idea is to get people who know you in different contexts to describe you and then kind of build a word cloud, look for themes, but also look for some of those outliers and also think a little bit, aspirationally, do you want to show up as one of these adjectives in other parts of your life potentially? And so it's a nice way to get students to think a little bit about how are you perceived, but also how aspirationally are you hoping to be perceived when you enter this next phase of your life.
Love those. Holly, any activities that you do with your students?
Oh, I don't know if I'm such an interrogator rather than like a fun activity person, besides some of these ones that I have also stolen. One topic that I do like to needle kids about too is I think so many of the questions in the supplements and related to the Common App have to do with what kind of human being are you socially? And there's no like good or bad, like I am social, I am not. But how do you build relationships that matter to you and what difference do you want to make in the world? And I think I like to ask that fairly early and often roundabout ways, right? You learn is like, does a student have a group of very close friends that they've been with since first grade. I had a student like that, and I'd just be like, that's remarkable and so rare nowadays. How do you do it? How do you stay together as that group, and how do you treat each other? And so that was one that ended up being an important supplemental essay for that student. But some other students may feel like, oh, well, I'm just not social. It's not something that I do, but they have a desire to make a change in the world. They have a sense of righteousness about, how things should be. And we can take that and explore of like what they want to, how they want to affect other people. So that usually is like a big line of questioning for me early on.
I love that. And I can see how that would help them with supplemental essays eventually too.
Mhm.
Um, Sheila, how do students know which of the, so, say they did the show and tell, how do they know which of their stories, which of their shown items to you belong in the personal statement, which story belongs in the personal statement versus elsewhere in their application?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Often they don't. Often, they come in with, oh, I'm going to write about this thing that I did. And I'm like, nope, we're not writing about that. It's too predictable. That's going to go somewhere else. I will say, if you don't have sort of the expertise of the people in this room to lean on to be like, what do we do where? There is sort of maybe a more methodical way that you could approach this. And what I like to do is think about the entire application as a content plan. It's a portfolio, right? Your transcript is saying something about your extracurriculars are saying something about you. Your teacher recommendations are saying something about you. And then, of course, all of the essays. And I often like to start mapping out content starting with the supplemental essays, because if those are the schools you're applying to, you are going to have to answer the question of maybe what's your academic interest, or what does your ideal college experience look like, or how does your identity influence you, right? These are some pretty common supplemental questions, though they're asked in different forms. So we start by filling in those pieces of the puzzle, to go back to Joanna's overall metaphor here. And that's going to leave us with something, right? What haven't we used yet? Or if this is all they get to know about you, what are they really missing, right? What does somebody who wants to know you somewhat deeply, what do they need to know about you in order to really have a picture? And then it usually becomes quite obvious, oh, I haven't told them about this thing yet. And that's how we kind of land on the personal statement. I will say, though, there have been many students I've worked with where we think something is a supplemental essay, and we have some other topic for the personal statement, and not exactly at the last minute, but maybe a month before deadlines, we're like, actually, I think these need to switch. You have to be a little bit flexible. You have to have a plan, but still be opportunistic.
Thank you. Anything else anyone else wants to share about how to know which pieces go where outside of what Sheila shared?
There's some stories that you just can't stop writing, or the student can't. It's not us. But I think, as Sheila was saying, like some supplemental essays take on a life of their own. And a student may begin to feel very invested in telling that story. And you kind of get a sense that, like, oh, this is the heart is here. And sometimes that happens as it just keeps growing, or there's more nuance, there's more things to say. And then the original topic that seems so great is maybe too straightforward to sustain that length.
That makes a lot of sense. Which now I'm curious to know, Holly, I'm going to ask you again, are there topics that students should avoid in their personal statement, or kind of what are the do's and don'ts of this essay?
Yeah. I always see that as a challenge. Not that you need to be risky or anything, purposefully, right? If you feel like you have to choose a topic that's edgy, you're doing it wrong. But some students have in their lives events that are seen by some as red flag events. It could be a mental health challenge or an eating disorder, or something that's happened in their family, or a death, or something like that they've been told by someone is too much. And I think, to me, it feels a little wrong to tell them that their life is too much to be admitted to college. If they want to tell the story and it's so fundamental to who they are, then we will do it with care. And we will do it with care for the admissions officers who are reading this because they are under a lot of strain. And, think about what it takes to receive that kind of story, which often means focusing on growth. It's not just bright siding things or making silver linings, but making sure that these stories have a clear purpose and are framed in a way that is helping the application, and really showing a true self. Things like engaging in criminal activity or other than there's some hard lines or things that would like need to be reported. Yeah, you don't necessarily need to go there, and that's just going to create complications and things. But I think if there is a drive to tell a story because it's so important to a student's truth, then it's worth exploring.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that. Um, Alex, I'm curious if you have anything else to share on the do's and don'ts.
Yeah, I think Holly's answer was really good and nuanced. I think maybe in addition to that, a lot of students feel like they have to talk about like a huge seismic event, and sometimes play up drama that doesn't really feel authentic to them and their story. And so trying to figure out like what is something that is authentic to them to talk about so they can talk about it, like Holly said, with heart and with passion from a place of really deeply knowing it in themselves, rather than this is a big, like, kind of fireworks sort of event that I need to describe because I have to grab my reader's attention. Um, and then I think sometimes maybe students that feel that they have to make their personal statement like incredibly academic, like this is a history of why I want to study this thing. For some students, that is the story, and they have really beautiful, really personal anecdotes that tell that. But it requires kind of looking at it from multiple angles and arriving naturally at that place rather than saying like I have to explain why this school or why this particular area of study. There are smaller questions probably peppered throughout their application that will get at those targeted questions anyway. So they don't feel like they have to tell like, a brief history of my academics and that either.
Mhm. Thank you. Sheila, Joanna, or Andy, do any of you have anything to share? Sheila, I thought you unmuted.
Always, yeah, always. Always have too much to say. I have been, writing my own book and talking with people who work on this topic sort of academically. And there's a lot of interesting work out there on the pressure students feel to perform an identity. And that might be the identity they think the college wants to see, the identity they think their parents expect from them, or society expects from them, or some sort of traumatized, marginalized identity. This is especially common with, students on the margins, people of color, immigrants, um, lower socioeconomic status, and no person is one story. And of course, we're all more than our trauma. Um, but for some students, that's a really important part of how they grew to be who they are. So it is a very delicate line to walk. But I find that performance as like a filter is a really helpful one for me. Are we performing an identity, or is this truly who you are, as I've experienced you over many, many months of, meetings and what I know about you from your family and things like that. So I just thought I would offer that.
Thank you. Mhm. Joanna, yeah.
And I don't want to belabor the point, but one of the questions, I'm a big believer that, I'm never going to tell a student what to do, right? So I'm not going to tell them you are doing this, you're not doing this, this is acceptable, this is unacceptable. I really try to help students sort of see a path and come to conclusions on their own. And so one of the questions that I'll oftentimes ask students if, because they may come in and think that, if they're thinking about things that have really influenced them or really shaped their life, and I think sometimes it's important for us to all remember too, we were all 16 and 17-year-olds at one point, and losing the state championship in lacrosse may really be the biggest catastrophe that has ever happened, especially if your team was favored heavily. But a lot of times I'll try to ask students, is there someone else who could tell this story? Like, do you think, if you write about how awful it was losing a state championship or losing something, do you think there's another high school student out there who's telling that same story? And 99% of the time they'll say, yeah, probably. And so and we use that as an opportunity then to say, it's not so much let's abandon that story, but, kind of to Holly's point, let's try to put a different lens on it and, and see, no one's going to be able to tell your story. So what is it about your story and the way that you have grown from this that now makes the story a little bit more unique? And so it takes the story in a slightly different direction without slapping a label, like that cliche label on it per se, which I think can sometimes, kind of to Holly's point, I think can sometimes do more harm than good when obviously we're all very well intentioned. So I think, handling with care is really important here. But also recognizing that, I think, everyone I think, who's joining today is obviously a parent. But recognizing that, we were all 16, 17-year-olds where things were magnified on a very different scale at that point. And so I think it's sometimes important to just, kind of adopt some of that perspective as well.
That's a really great point. Thank you, Joanna. It sounds like everyone here takes the approach of really putting the student at the center of their experiences and making sure that this is written from their lens, which is exactly how it should be done since it's their application. But I do want to hear a little bit more about some memorable college essays that you have worked on or that you've read in some capacity, and why they were memorable. Um, Joanna, do any come to mind for you?
Gosh, I feel like I could have a whole webinar just on this alone. Maybe these are all ideas for a book. I don't know. Um, I think there are two that I'll share really quickly that come to mind. I had a student recently who really wanted to be who wanted to be a math major, um, and came into our sessions. I'm a math person. I'm not a writer. I don't like writing. This is not something, and really wanted to write about why she wanted to be a math major in her essay. And and very similar to what my colleagues have shared, we talked a lot about, well, what are some things that you really love? And one day she showed up to a meeting and she was really frustrated. And I asked her, what's up? And she's like, I don't understand why I can't have cake for lunch. And and she went to this whole thing about how her mom had baked a cake and told her that she wasn't allowed to have the cake, that they had to save it for dessert. And she was so funny because she used a theorem from trigonometry, and then she used this logic sort of concept called proof by contradiction to mathematically prove to her mom why it made sense to have cake before dessert, or why she should have it for lunch. And she's telling this story, very similar to what Sheila was sharing earlier. I had this light bulb moment. You just wrote your essay. This is how you show how much you love math because you can apply it in real life terms. And she wrote an entire personal statement about basically it started off with a story about why cake mathematically should be consumed before dessert. And I absolutely loved that essay. And then on a flip side, I do want to share one that just really quickly that sort of does highlight sort of some of this trauma, but doing so in a more nuanced way. I had a student who really was very sheltered, and he wanted to talk about how sheltered he had been his whole life growing up, and in doing so, what we actually stumbled upon was this idea that it wasn't until he went to visit colleges that he actually spent his first night away from home. He's like, I'm 18 years old and I've just spent my first night away from my parents. And we used that actually as sort of the foundation for his story. And that was he counted out how many nights he had spent at home and then what that first night away actually meant and that was sort of a gateway to the possibilities that the world would sort of hold. And it was a very thoughtful way of sort of sharing a little bit of a glimpse into what it felt like living within those four walls for 18 years, but also very, very hopeful because he candidly, he didn't know what the outside world sort of held, but it was really hopeful and aspirational in the same way. So it was a nice, very nuanced way, I think, of trying to approach something that could be perceived as a bit traumatic and maybe a red flag. But I think in a way that really shared a more sensitive side to him.
I want to read all of these now. Thank you for sharing those. Alex, do you have memorable essays that you've worked on or ones that you've read that stick out to you?
Yeah, I think one of the ones that still remains my favorite was with a student who was a good student and said, like, I'm solid in school. I do my extracurriculars. I love my hometown. I'm really close to my mom, but like, there's nothing to talk about here that would stand out. And it took, several sessions to build a relationship, to talk through lots of other ideas, to try on other ideas. And, when it felt like we were in an impasse, when she said, like, I just don't think there's anything super special about me. I don't think there's anything that stands out. I realized at that point that she had been repeating, but like, I love my town and I'm a homebody and I really love just like the coziness of where I am. And when I asked her to like really dig into that, we came up with this kind of quirky but beautiful, essentially her story of how she and her mom had moved away from the dad and the brother, and were living kind of separately. And so, like during COVID, the way that they created community was like going to their local Irish pub. And we were like, can we write about this? And it turned out that like, yeah, there was a way that they could write about it because it was a restaurant and a place where they really connected with the owners and the staff there. They supported them during the pandemic, sitting outside and like drinking hot cocoa together. And it was a story that not only showed her love for her hometown, her connection to her mom and these people around her that you wouldn't necessarily think this high schooler would click with. It also just showed that she had the capacity and the desire to build community in unexpected places wherever she went. And when she started to write that, she realized like, oh, there is something really special about me and the life that I'm living. It was a beautiful reflective exercise. And she ended up saying that she loved writing it, which as a teacher and as a writing specialist is like the goal is I learned something while I was doing this and I enjoyed it. And it was something that helped her kind of seal the deal with the school that she knew she wanted to be at. So, chef's kiss.
I love that story. I don't know if I've heard that one before. That's really incredible. Um, Sheila, I also want to ask you if you have a memorable essay that's standing out to you.
I have too many. One I always talk about is one of my very high achieving students who had a lot of things that you would stereotypically think he could write about, but we decided to write about his favorite food, and what it meant to him, the different contexts he's eaten it in, and how it's sort of a metaphor for his drive for community, which is really kind of one of the things that made him tick. So, is a really beautiful one that his parents were like, wait, are we really writing about this dish that we make fun of him for taking pictures of everywhere we eat it? Like, really? Are you sure? But he ended up at Dartmouth, which if anybody, knows the Dartmouth essays or anything about the Dartmouth community, they were really, really big on that sense of community. And so it was the perfect essay to lead his application. Um, but I also wanted to throw back to an essay that Alex worked on with one of the students we worked together on last year. This is a student who did not have great grades, did not have a ton of extracurriculars, was really living in the shadow of her two older brothers, and was a very different kind of student. And she had a lot of regret that she didn't take school seriously sooner. She now had come into a place where she had a lot of ambition, and could really see her future very clearly, but was like, what do I do with all this stuff that I don't really identify with anymore? And I'm going to throw it back to Alex to tell the rest of the story because you did such an amazing job with her.
I'm not sure I remember which student you're talking about.
Oh, all right, I'll give you a hint. I don't want to say her name, but you started by having her write a love letter to herself.
Oh, yeah. I think in that case it was really an opportunity to get the student to like understand a little bit of who she is by thinking about like what she would say to herself through that love letter. And I think that it kind of evolved from there. It didn't stay there, but I think that was like the key to unlock just like all of the wonderful things about who she is that she wasn't seeing. Like a lot of it was, I think, like hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, it was such a great switch of frame to think about her strengths and the things she did like about herself instead of all the stuff that she regretted or wished were different. And to like put the cherry on the top of that story, she got in everywhere she applied, including places nobody thought she would get into. She came out with hundreds of thousands of dollars of merit aid. and is at King's College this fall in London, which again, everybody was like, we don't know if that's going to happen, but it did. And I think it's because she took herself seriously in this way.
And she told a story that only she could tell and started to like take herself seriously because of it. Yeah. The call from her was incredible when she finally called and said like, "Oh my gosh, not only did I love the essay, I really enjoyed writing it, even though I thought I wasn't going to like writing this and it felt like a drudgery for a long time." And like I can't believe it. It unlocked the thing that I was hoping for.
That's so wonderful. Um, Andy and Holly, I also want to give you a chance to share a story about a memorable essay. I know you both have worked on countless, but a quick one if you do have one to share. Holly, do you want to start?
Oh, I was going to make Andy start. Yeah, what's a recent memorable essay? Andy, you go. I'm blanking.
Oh, sure. I don't have a great memory for these, but or for anything else for that matter. But there was one that Sheila and I worked on um, that I thought was absolutely brilliant. I don't think we ever really heard back about what his results were, but that's not what this is about. Um, he really creative kid. He was a graffiti artist, and interesting life story. And he just really didn't want to write a typical essay. So he wrote half of it uh, as a dialogue, speaking like very slangily with his two sort of fellow, sort of talking street, the way that he and his two friends um, communicate. And then we also interspersed some more kind of standard conventional reflective things. And it was one where it definitely felt like we were taking a bit of a risk, but I think by the end of it, we all thought that, yeah, he kind of hit a home run. And it was definitely his essay.
Mhm. I remember that student.
Okay, I'm ready. So the student I'm thinking of, this was a absolutely brilliant student and very accomplished in both engineering, like robotics track to engineering, and as an artist, and had done several, prestigious short-term residency things and donor work, and really, really wanted to continue to do both. So there was a million things she could talk about, and she was so impressive. But what we ended up zeroing in on her essay, her main essay was about her creative process. And what she did, the quirky thing that she did every single night is at, before like 9:45 to 10, she would sit down and she'd write that was her writing time every single night. And she looked forward to it forever, and no one ever saw it. It was not for anyone else. It was her time to write. And so she went from a child that couldn't focus on anything and was all over the place. And she had a really funny description of that, of just like, everyone's like, what are we going to do with you? Like pay attention, to realizing that everything she was seeing and experiencing was like food for her writing. And she would be like, oh, I'm going to write about this later. And so she would like clue into the exact same thing. And so somehow she'd stumbled upon the a trick and a key to her own creative process that allowed her, who may have had some attention issues or seemed like that when she was younger, to be someone who was just continuously enthralled by the world. Um, and she ended up at Yale. She achieved all the things that her application allowed her to achieve the things that she was certainly capable of. But I loved that we didn't have to. We showed something that was one of her most private things, right? Like no one sees her writing; it's all for her. But she was able to show that very special piece, and then let all of her recommenders and her activities and all of those things speak for itself.
I just love hearing all these stories. Thank you for sharing that. Um, but now I'm curious. We've touched a little bit upon this as you've answered these questions, but Sheila, if you have a student who approaches you and says, I don't think I have anything special to write about, how do you navigate that with them?
I'll tell you, that's most students. So this is like a daily conversation over here. Most of them don't think that they're special. And I find that that comes from two things. One is, we all live our lives, so it's normal to us, right? We don't know how special we are because we don't ever get that kind of distance to observe ourselves, or really understand what other people are doing. I think, the closest a lot of students get to this is social media, which we know is like, very curated, all AI, all filters. So like, what is real? Um, so they don't know how special they are. The other thing is they think colleges want something, I don't know, spectacular, some achievement, something, um, an accomplishment, something related to like being better than, right? Everybody else being better than the competition. And that's not really what colleges are looking for, as we've all kind of said. We really want to understand who a student is and what makes them tick and how they treat people. And that has nothing to do with beating the competition. Um, so I usually start there by telling them those two things. And then I will tell them, the silly things that turned into brilliant essays that other students have written about. And, in some cases, I do tell them where that student ended up because it helps them know it's possible, right? We don't have to have one of these achievement oriented essays in order to get into this school or that school or to just be successful in life. Oftentimes, it's the small thing, something that seems totally mundane, that really opens a window to who they are and who they'll be on a campus. So I do a little perspective setting. When I'm talking to a parent, I use very different language. I mean, sometimes I'll say the same thing, but I will talk about capitalism and scarcity, and things like that, because that's really what's in our heads, making us think we have to compete, we have to beat everybody, we have to win this game. But that's actually not how this game is structured.
Thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Um, Now, say a student has written and written and written and written. Andy, how do they know when they're done when you're working with students?
Yeah, th this could happen in a few ways. I mean, I'm tempted to say you sort of know when you know, but there are other ways that it can kind of come to a conclusion. Sometimes a deadline. Ideally, we're not actually working. We try our hardest to not even come close to those deadlines, but we do get some stragglers every now and again. Um, um, this was a first for last season. I just had a student who was like, "I'm done. I can't do it anymore." You know, and there's as all of these kids have a lot going on, and writing is often not their favorite activity. So in that case, this was with Joanna. We just did our best to kind of help them hobbling across the finish line. And it was in a very good place, so it wasn't at all a concern. Um, but I think you often reach a point where, from an editing perspective, the writing is as good as it's going to be, right? There's nothing extra, there's nothing missing, it all flows, and the rest of it. And you've also made the decisions that you want to make, right? Because there are all sorts of trade-offs, right? And at this stage, it's become, explicit. Well, if we do this, we lose this, but if we have that, we can do this. And once you've made those decisions, you're kind of done, right? Because you keep going back and forth, but you know, you're it's fine either way. So once you're comfortable with those decisions, then I think you're pretty much there.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I do want to be mindful with time. So I want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about you all as parents and how you can be involved in this process. So Joanna, I'm curious to hear kind of how you navigate the parent-student relationship and how parents can involve themselves in their students' writing.
No, this is a great question, and this is one that spend a lot of time talking about. I think one of the things that and it's funny, I've been working in this space for a very long time. the way that I communicate with students and parents shifted once I became a parent. And I find that, like many of you, I get a lot of one-word answers from my 8-year-old. And I realize that, sometimes kids are not the best communicators. It's like that game telephone. And so one of the things that I've realized is that you can't always depend on kids to be the messenger when it comes to things like progress. If you're thinking about just sort of from a, 12, 30,000 feet, how you're project managing this. But once you get into the weeds, I do like to have conversations with parents on a regular basis. When we first start coaching, maybe it's quarterly, but once we actually get into the weeds, it's usually monthly. And I'm very transparent about things like timelines and project plans, which I build out for students and families. But there's sort of, there's some guardrails there. And I always tell parents, I'm never going to share an essay with you that your child has not given me permission to share. That's something for you two to chat about. Um, and I think that it is helpful to give kids some space to recognize that there are some things that they may want to workshop either on their own or with a coach. Again, these kids, there's so much pressure on them, often very much self-inflicted. And I find that, they write with their audience in mind. And if they know that mom or dad or a step parent is going to be reading something, it does color the way and affect the way that they choose to write. So I encourage parents to, to push, to have open conversations, but not necessarily to push and not be offended if their child doesn't want to share what they're working on in real time. And just trust the process and trust the fact that you've raised a great human and that they're going to be just fine. Um, and I think the only other thing I would just mention here is, I do remind parents all the time that, because I get a lot of parents who will say like, well, I wrote about, they think they're helping because they're like, well, I wrote about this in my application. Um, and I like to remind parents too that, admissions is very different now than it was, 15, 20, 25 years ago. And the essay that you wrote isn't necessarily going to work today, mainly because the essay is not the essay doesn't reflect your child's life. And so I think all of that comes from a very good place. But I really encourage parents, use a coach if you're working with someone, if you're working with with a coach, use that person to deliver that news. Preserve your relationship with your child and use us. Use someone like Sheila or Holly or Andy or Alex or me to kind of be the bad guy a little bit, and to deliver some of that hard feedback, because it really does. As everyone knows, I think it does take a village. It does take a team approach, and so really thinking about this approach very much as, we are on team fill in the blank for the child's name, and that we all have their best interests in mind. I think that goes a long way in trying to sort of smooth out some of those potential conflicts and some of those little bit, bits that are a bit uncomfortable.
Mm, thank you. That was a great call out too. I've talked to a bunch of parents in my time at Signet, and something that I constantly hear is, this is causing tension in our household. And so we need to bring in a party to kind of reduce some of that tension. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we can open up the chat for questions and answers. But Sheila, how can parents help students plan for their essays when the deadlines feel so far away?
Yeah, it's a hard line for a parent to hold. So I will also plus up what Joanna said, like bring somebody else in. I mean, it could be one of us. It could be the English teacher at their school. It could be an older relative or cousin or something like that, that your student is going to respond to better than you, because they will almost always respond to someone else better than they will respond to their own parents. It's just a fact. But I will also pick up on something that Joanna dropped there, which is the project plan. I love a project plan. Like everything in my life has a spreadsheet with a deadline and who's doing what. Because it's how I keep my sanity, and it will really help you as well. So we map out all of the essays. We understand the priorities. What are the early schools? What's the early decision school versus an early action school? What could be moved from early to regular if we're in a pinch, right? So we're managing the workload. And then also keeping track of which essays overlap with which. So we can start with, maybe the longest version of a single question, and then create the other versions from there. Holly, you do a really great job of that. I've always appreciated that about your approach to this. And then, of course, the standard break it into smaller pieces and interim deadlines. But the accountability piece is going to be different for every student, right? They're going to want a different kind of accountability, or maybe a different accountability partner for this process. So you have to figure out what's actually going to work for your kid, instead of just create tension and, cause you to feel like a nag. So it's difficult is my answer, is the short answer.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, Joanna, Alex, Sheila, Holly, and Andy for all of your thoughtful responses today. Audience members, I'd love to know if you have any questions. Please feel free to drop them in the chat or come off mute and ask them. We do have some couple of minutes here. Don't be afraid. Well, I don't know if anyone's typing, but
I'll
I can
ask a
ask.
question.
Yeah, you got one, Andy?
I'm just, imagining, some of the folks in the audience hearing about some of these great essays that we've helped sort of Sherpa along, and maybe having a concern around, well, my kid is maybe not like the most naturally introspective or reflective, and it sounds like you really have to go deep with these. Um, and in case that's somebody's question, I thought I would just offer a thought, um, which is partly that's exactly what we're here for, and some of the most rewarding experiences that I've had while wearing this hat at Signet has been where we're not only writing essays and obviously doing the job, but actually kind of bringing, revealing a new facet of the student to themselves, and facilitating, the sort of first really big, extended, reflective, introspective experience. Um, the other answer is not every essay is sort of, a huge exploration of the subconscious or anything like that, right? They take, all sorts of forms. Anyway, just my 2 cents in case anyone had that thought, and
Uh,
since nobody was asking questions.
that's quite beautiful, Andy. Thank you for asking and answering that one. I'm sure someone else had that too. Saba, I'm seeing a hand raised. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, yeah. So I have a son who's just finishing up his 10th grade year. So he's about to go into his junior year now. As far as like timelines and when to start thinking about the essay, how much time would you say is enough, right, for us now that we have a little bit of time to really think about it and get started? In my head, I was thinking, well, over the summer of junior year might be a good time to get all of this done, but is this something that we have to start thinking about even before then? Just trying to like project plan in my head.
Mm.
You said my favorite word, Summer, so I'm gonna jump in. The project plan. Um, so yes, most students do write their essays over the summer. That's typically when we do the writing work with our students as well, right? School's out, we're starting our, real writing process. But there's a lot of work that goes into it before we can start writing, right? We got to build our school list, which I usually do with my students in the fall and winter of junior year, because the school list determines the audience that you're speaking to and can help shape the stories that you want to tell in your application. We also have to think about our overall application strategy, right? By the end of junior year, they're probably asking their teachers for recommendations. So what are those teachers going to say? And how can we have the rest of the application resonate, but not necessarily repeat, which is Holly's phrase, the content of those recommendations? And how can we make sure the recommendations are really fueling the message that we want the application to tell? And then we have to do all the mapping of the essay prompts and figure out all of those things so that we know what we're writing in those essays for what word count and what particular inflection because of the way the question was asked. So only when we have all of that in place can we say, all right, we're ready to start writing. Right. And of course, during that process, we're doing a lot of the conversations that you've heard about here. We're, dropping in those exercises, pulling out on themes that might be valuable for the essay writing process, but we're not actually putting that in front of the student as an assignment. Now you go write your essay yet. So I always say sophomore spring is the best time to get started on this process. There's not a lot of intensive work to do, but you can lay a foundation that will set you up for that later success. But we do have a lot of students who come in right at the beginning of junior spring. And we do a little bit of a rush to figure out the school list and all of that, but then we're ready to write by the summertime.
Thanks, Sheila. Um, I want to thank you all so much for coming today. Next month, we are actually going to have Holly host a um, writing essay workshop for students. So please, if your student has an idea or a semblance of an idea and they want to get a chunk of work done over the summer before time slips away, um, please keep a lookout in your emails. We'll be sending out the information for that this week, and you'll want to make sure to save your spot. Um, so thank you all again. I hope you found this helpful. We will be sending out recap and recording, like I said, via email later this week, and along with information about the writing workshop so that your students can get ahead on this process. But had so much fun with you all today. Thank you to our panelists again, too. Have a great night, everybody.